Yes.
Okay. Welcome to today's presentation. It's about Rawls' theory of civil disobedience, and I will specifically critique his justification and his conceptualization of civil disobedience. So let's start. Firstly, I'm going to talk about Rawls as a person, then I'm going to explain his theory quite broadly, and then I'm going to provide some critiques of Rawls' theory of civil disobedience. Yeah, I mean, you might all be already familiar, but especially for those who now watch us on YouTube, who is this John Rawls? He is one of the most influential moral and political philosophers in the 20th century, and he used to be a professor at Harvard. He was born in 1921 and died in 2002. And I think that's quite important because that shows us in which time frame he was active, and especially which kind of social and economic and political issues were present at that time. I mean, if you think about it, A Theory of Justice, one of his most influential books, was published in 1971. And in that time, well, the civil rights movement was completely taking over the US, and the Korean War was going on. The rise of the welfare state in several countries of the world. So there were a lot of issues concerning justice. And it was a topic that was widely discussed and also quite controversial. And he provided a conceptualization of justice, and in that way also a conceptualization of civil disobedience from an egalitarian liberalist standpoint. Well, what is egalitarian liberalism? That is basically the thought that you have some individual liberties, such as the freedom of conscience and freedom of expression, the right to personal property. But aside from it, you also have a principle of equality of opportunity. So this is the egalitarian aspect in this certain political orientation. And Rawls defines, as I said, he thinks that there should be basic liberties for all citizens, and he defines that in his liberty principle. There's another principle that I think is quite important to understand Rawls, and that is the difference principle, and that states that, well, we don't have to have strict equality, but only as long as the inequalities in questions would make the least advantaged in society materially better off than they would under strict equality. So now I've told you a little bit about Rawls himself, and let's switch to the main topic of today, namely civil disobedience. So what is civil disobedience? You might have a rough idea, maybe pictures like this come up if you think about the topic. On the left, for example, you see protesters in the Black Lives Matter movement who were protesting in so-called die-in, which means that you lie on the street and pretend to be dead to protest against police killings. And they were thereby disrupting the traffic. Another example is for climate protesters who occupied forests in Germany. But then it becomes more tricky because we also have images such as the one on the right one, where extreme right-wing people were storming the Capitol. So does that then also count as civil disobedience? And what kind of principles can we create to kind of justify what counts as civil disobedience and what shouldn't count as civil disobedience? That's the main question that Rawls asks himself. And he thereby finds an answer, and he defines civil disobedience as a public, non-violent, conscientious, yet political act contrary to the law, usually done with the aim of bringing about a change in the law or policies of the government. So as you can see, there are certain aspects here in this definition, and let's just walk through them so we know what he's talking about. So the first aspect is that civil disobedience should be political. but what does that now mean? I mean, isn't everything kind of political? Well, for Rawls, something is political if you don't talk about it in terms of your own personal morality, but you refer to principles that are generally agreed upon. So for example, in the Constitution, or the principle I've talked about beforehand, such as the liberal principles. These are principles that exist in a society and that we all acknowledge. And therefore, when you engage in civil disobedience, you should refer to these principles. And that then also means that you appeal to the majority and you try to persuade the majority by kind of referring to that shared conception, and thereby a minority will be succeeding in persuading the majority. The second aspect is that civil disobedience has to be public. This means that, well, you should engage in it openly, also with fair notice, and it shouldn't be something that you do in your room, because otherwise no one will notice. The third aspect is that it should be non-violent. And I think that's one of the most interesting claims, and a claim that we will later on also discuss critically, because Rawls is basically saying that a civil disobedient act has to be non-violent because it strengthens the sincerity of one's claim. So you can think about like this: a person who protests peacefully will just be taken more seriously by people who are not involved in the protest, compared to when a person is violently destroying, for example, property. Because once other people see what you're protesting against, for example, on the news or in the newspaper, they will be more likely to evaluate the cause you are fighting for as important and positive if you do not rely on violence. But again, this is not me who's saying this, but Rawls, and a lot of people have been quite critical about this claim. And he also justifies this claim by saying that, well, if you act violently, then you kind of interfere with the civil liberties of others. So, for example, the property, through property destruction, you interfere with the right to personal property, and that would go against the liberal constitution. So you basically can't do that. And another reason is that you have to show your general fidelity to law. What this means is that you accept the legal consequences of your conduct by engaging in civil disobedience. So if you get a fine for lying on the street, then you have to accept and pay that fine. And that is because, again, otherwise you cannot persuade the majority of your cause. And also because this expresses that you generally accept the legal framework and the system you're living in. And that is quite interesting, because that already shows that for him, civil disobedience is something that happens within the already existing framework and cannot transform or disrupt this framework. And in this way, he holds that militant actions, for example, do not count as civil disobedience. And lastly, it has to be conscientious, and this means that you should thoroughly think about it and provide reasons for it, that again appeal to political principles mentioned beforehand. And and you shouldn't just wake up one day and say, okay, I'm gonna now start a protest. Now, I've already mentioned the fidelity argument, and I've already said that here the acceptance of legal consequences of civil disobedience is important. And I want to further talk about it because critics have also specifically addressed this claim. And the idea is basically that the acceptance of the legal consequences become a duty. And he thereby says that we must pay a certain price to convince others that our actions have, in our carefully considered view, a sufficient moral basis in the political convictions of the community. So it's not only a right that you just conventionally have to follow, but it becomes a matter of morality. And he illustrates this by comparing it to the rule of promising. And normally, if you make a promise, I mean, you make it and it's kind of conventionally agreed upon that you then also do what you've said you would do. But he says that, well, with the principle of fidelity, that's of course also the case, but as I said, it's a moral principle, and it's a principle of fairness, because you, by acting in civil disobedience, create a certain burden on society. So, for example, you disrupt traffic. That's probably cost someone something. And by accepting the legal consequences, it's kind of fair because it restores the balance between the cost that the others have to take because of your actions and the cost that you have to take. But again, this can be seen quite critical, and we're going to talk about that later. So now let's quickly talk about what he assumes that civil disobedience is placed in. I mean, there's always a certain context that these actions, in which these actions occur. And for Rawls, this is the nearly just society. But what is a nearly just society? I mean, that's quite an ambiguous term. Like, how do we determine that? And he says that it's basically a democratic society where the authority is established by voting, so by a process of legitimization. And you have to have a constitution with basic individual liberties I've been talking about earlier. So you can see, well, Rawls basically narrows down his theory to a few Western countries. And he explicitly states it does not apply to other forms of government. And he then also just uses the nearly perfect state of justice to defend the fidelity argument. Because he says that, well, in a state of near justice, we normally have a duty to comply with unjust laws because the constitution is generally just and you should support a generally just constitution. So basically, because your rights are generally respected by the state, and only in one very particular instance, this has not been the case, you should express that you generally support the system you're living in. And now let's talk about what kind of issues he considers as justified for acting in civil disobedience. So he basically says that not every issue justifies civil disobedience. And in his discussion, he kind of limits it to internal issues, which I think also shows in which kind of time he was writing his theory in, because if you think about it now, I mean, most protest movements all happen transnationally, and globalization is quite an important term, which in his time probably hasn't been as present in the literature. And he writes that, for simplicity, I shall limit the discussion to domestic institutions, and so to injustices internal to a given society, which already limits the discussion quite a lot, and also, misses this certain transnational aspect of topics such as Me Too, for example. And a second point is that he limits civil disobedience to instances of, how he calls it, substantial and clear injustice. Well, who now determines substantial and clear injustice? He says that, again, it should be, of course, to political topics, as we've already seen, but especially to the principle he beforehand has illustrated as the most important one. So equal liberty and fair equality of opportunity, for example. And examples that he provides to make it a little bit more vivid is that minorities, for example, are denied the right to vote or to hold office or to own property, or when certain religious groups are repressed and denied various opportunities. So in these cases, you are allowed to engage in civil disobedience, and it's mostly about constitutional rights. The last point I want to mention about his theory is that he really sees civil disobedience as a last resort. So it's kind of not something that positive in a way, because he says, well, yeah, if you have to do it, okay, do it. But there are other steps that should be taken beforehand. Because beforehand you should make what he's called so-called normal appeals to the majority. And only if the majority is really like immovable and apathetic, and if there's no attention to your issue at all, you're kind of allowed to then engage in civil disobedience. And this especially comes important if we later look into radical democratic theory. So yeah, let's look into what other more critical voices have to tell us. So I want to quickly mention 3 camps, although I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm going to go into especially 2 critiques in a little bit more depth, but just so you heard about them, there are, for example, the radical democratic theorists who claim that, well, Rawls' theory is just way too restrictive. I mean, why should violence not be used to further one's claims, for example? And in several other aspects, they also critique Rawls' theory, and I'm going to explain that in a second. And the second group is, for example, critical race theorists. So you can think about authors such as Charles Mills, who has heavily critiqued Rawls for not engaging with racial issues at all in his writings. And he says that it would have been natural for Rawls to do so because he lived in a time where he was basically surrounded by the issue. And this kind of, for Charles Mills, also shows the intrinsic whiteness of Rawls as a theorist. It's quite interesting to see that, yeah, he doesn't really talk about the racial issues or race as such. He once mentions Martin Luther King in the footnotes, and he says that, well, that would be actually a good illustration of an effective person who engaged in civil disobedience. And that's quite interesting because this means that he assumed the US in the 1970s, 1960s to be a nearly just society, which then becomes somehow really weird if you think about it, because you might have pictures of racial segregation in mind, and that for many people does not count as a nearly just society. So a lot of critical race theorists provided critiques of this nearly just society assumption that Rawls brings forward. And especially because Rawls' theory misses the point of telling us how to transform from an unjust society to a just society. And then there are also feminist theories, and they have criticized, as you might, as I've already said, like he says that, well, civil disobedience should be public, not only in the way how it's performed, but also regarding the issues, because there should be political. And a lot of feminist theorists have critiqued this kind of private-public distinction that he thereby uses. But now let's really go into 2 critiques in depth. So firstly, I want to talk about the radical democratic theory, and that is by Jakobs. I don't know if any of you know him, but he's also teaching at the University of Amsterdam and quite a prominent scholar when it comes to civil disobedience. And he basically says that Rawls' definition of civil disobedience is way too narrow. While it provides a useful starting point, he acknowledges this, it ultimately leads to an overly constrained, domesticated, and sanitized understanding of this complex political practice. And he thereby critiques that Rawls places his focus too much on the appeal to the majority, so that minorities have to kind of, defend their claims and persuade the majority, because I now state him again, civil disobedience seems at odds with and indeed directed against the majority moral sentiments. It is often precisely the failures of a misguided sense of justice that make civil disobedience necessary in the first place. So it is really a critique of this assumption that there is an already established conception of justice present in that society. And yeah, and now another point that I want to mention is that he also criticizes Rawls' fidelity argument, which I have talked about earlier, and also the public and nonviolent nature of civil disobedience. And he does so because he says that, well, maybe limited forms of violence might even be more effective in leading towards change, because they kind of wake up the majority and make them realize the dissatisfaction of a minority, and thereby make them kind of reconsider their thoughts about a certain issue. And yeah, and that I think gives us a quite different picture of how we can determine the effectiveness of civil disobedience. And I think another point is quite interesting, because Rawls assumes that you have to accept the legal consequences, right, of one's actions. And that then also leaves us with the question, yeah, but what does it entail if you have to accept the legal consequences of an action? That means that you have to be that you have to be economically able to pay for the repercussions of civil disobedience. And that already limits the people who are free to engage in civil disobedience, because you have to have a certain economic standard to do so. And if you think about it, I think that's quite funny that himself, I quoted him earlier on, and Rawls there says we have to pay a certain price to convince others. And if you now think about the economic aspect, it's almost as if it's meant literally, like you literally have to pay a certain price. And he then provides a less restrictive definition of civil disobedience. He says that civil disobedience is an intentionally unlawful and principled collective act of protest. He says that, yeah, this might be quite an ambiguous definition, but it has to be ambiguous to allow for a diverse range of actions of civil disobedience. He, for example, doesn't put the emphasis so much on citizens, that it has to be citizens that have to engage in civil disobedience, which Rawls does. And in that way, Rawls kind of assumes quite a legal interpretation of what a citizen is. And Selikatis says that he explicitly does not want to do this, because otherwise you again exclude certain people from protesting. No, what he wants to do is that he defines citizens in the broadest sense possible. And yeah, and another point that I found quite interesting is that, because Rawls says that civil disobedience should be the last resort, right? It should only be done if really no other means are effective. And Selikatis sees this quite differently, because he says that civil disobedience will always lead to more democracy, and because it will produce deliberation. He thereby states that it is an expression of a democratic practice of collective self-determination. So in itself, the act in itself is already democratic, and it is also democratic in its consequences, because it is a dynamizing counterweight to the rigidifying tendencies of state institutions. Thereby, he holds that it's almost unavoidable for democratic deficits to occur in a democratic society, because there are power differences in the public debate, and institutions just tend to accumulate power. So we need something to stop this from happening and going into like the wrong direction. And civil disobedience does that, because it sets boundaries to democratic deficits through its confrontational character, and it has to be confrontational. So thereby he also justifies the use of violence if necessary to keep checks and balances. And he thereby states that it can counter deliberative inertia. So deliberative inertia is basically when institutionalized processes of opinion and will formation keep certain topics out from the debate in the first place and off the agenda. And civil disobedience can be helpful to break up these patterns, because suddenly you have maybe a violent act or something that gets a lot of media attention, and people suddenly realize, oh yeah, there was an issue that was actually never presented in the institutional realm. So yeah, to conclude, I think these two authors, Rawls on the one and Silicates on the other side, quite differ in how they evaluate civil disobedience in their beneficial consequences for democracy. And now I want to talk about Bleicher's critique, who also goes into the same direction, but actually maybe also takes it a step further and critiques the whole system of modernity. And he thereby provides a critique of Rawlsian liberalism and says that there's a problem because as a person who engages in civil disobedience, according to Rawls, you have to accept the legal and political framework, and that somehow seems weird to him. He says that while giving the appearance of radical dissent, nonviolent civil disobedience is a reformist practice that often strengthens the existing societal order, in being tolerated only as long as the liberal constitutional framework is not disputed. Civil disobedience refuses to question the values of its own political foundations. And what he thereby want to highlight is that Rawls kind of pushes for a political liberal agenda while not pretending to do so, because he basically says that that liberal institutions exclude other non-liberal ways of thinking by repression, by narrowing down what civil disobedience can be and what it shouldn't be. And he then also refers to Nietzsche, who kind of has this very prominent thought that liberal institutions cease to be liberal as soon as they are established because of their then authoritative nature. And he, and again want to state Bleicher, he says, Rawls' hypothetically derived and commonly shared assumptions are liberal assumptions. His facts are liberal facts. Not even the veil of ignorance can cover the underlying political agenda of the original position. So civil disobedience then becomes a tool to legitimize the current liberal order and to establish more control. And he then also provides a critique of modernism through this, because he says that the image of human agency entailed in the liberal civil disobedience incarnates the modern obsession with control, the desire for order, for certainty. Because it limits civil disobedience so much and presses it into the current legal and political framework, it basically shows this, like, yeah, as he says, modern obsession with control, and to basically through state institutions regulate what citizens should do, how they should express their opinions, how they should protest against power. And Bleicher sees this quite critical, and in that way is maybe also close to Silicates. I mean, their approach is quite different in how they criticize Rawls, but he also in his text argues that, for example, violence should be used, or could be used at least, when acting in civil disobedience. And in that way, these authors might actually be closer than it first appears they are. Yeah, now I've talked a lot, and I quickly want to tell you a little bit, maybe summarize the thoughts that we've gathered. So yeah, as I've illustrated, Rawls and his critics diverge in several points. They diverge in the context, the view of about the context that civil disobedience takes place in, about the role of violence, about the actors that can engage in civil disobedience, and the issues that justify civil disobedience. I think it's quite important to also realize that Rawls himself does not consider certain issues that are nowadays particularly present, such as transnationalism of social movements. And in that way, we really have to also ask, okay, is Rawls' theory contemporary? Even if we like this the theory, even if you're someone who thinks that civil disobedience should be limited to Rawls requirements. The question is still, yeah, but what do we do with it when it comes to digitalization and globalization? Yeah, if you have any questions, you can always ask, and thank you for listening. Okay, I talk quite fast. I feel like it. I finished 10 minutes early, but yeah. Yeah, you have a question?
Yes, well, first of all, not a question, but I just wanted to say that I really liked the presentation. I mean, I think I also tend to talk quite fast, so it didn't really occur to me. I moved along well. I do have some knowledge of Rawls's theory and actually also some knowledge of criticisms towards him. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was really comprehensive and you got through it, yeah, really concisely. It was just really compact in the ideal way, and it, to me, it just brought along everything it had to. It left everything in the back that it had to. That was pretty enjoyable. Thank you.
Thank you. That's nice to you.
I have a maybe sort of superficial question for this for starters. In what context did you work on Rawls and criticism against him? Is this for like a paper or like for a thesis or something?
Yeah, I've now been writing about it quite a few times in several contexts. I've like on the one side, I analyzed the British civil rights movement and kind of civil disobedience that took place there, and compared different theories of civil disobedience, and also thereby provided a critique of Rawls. So yeah, mostly I've been working on post-colonial critiques, related to racial justice. And yeah, I think I'm going to write my thesis about it, actually. I'm now in the process of starting it. I have to submit my research proposal in 2 weeks. And yeah, let's see.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, I too have some prior knowledge of Rawls, but hearing about his theory of civil disobedience was kind of new to me. And in that sense, thank you so much for your presentation. It was very comprehensive, very understandable, and you explained it very, very well. And I also liked how you did the slides. It looked so nice and aesthetically pleasing. I know it's not like part of all the professional stuff, but it looks so nice. And that was really a very, very good presentation. And I really enjoyed hearing about that. And also like maybe connecting to Jendrik's question, if you are going to write about it, do you have like anything in mind, like any research question, or how do you want to work with Rawls' theory?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I was thinking about kind of criticizing the assumption of citizenship, and kind of because I don't know if you know the court case of the Mangrove 9, and like, yeah, there were several court cases basically in the British civil rights movement that I'm super interested in, and the police kind of engaged in a rhetoric of threat, and they specifically threatened people of color who were coming from Commonwealth countries, and they were kind of saying like, yeah, we can deport you, basically. And I think that's quite interesting how citizenship and not being a citizen in its fullest sense, legal sense, excludes you then from the freedom of protest, to kind of show this conflict between, on the one side, the freedom of protest, on the other side, citizenship. But yeah, I don't really know. I still have to formulate research questions, and also I couldn't find accessible data, and that's always kind of the problem. Yeah, but let's see. But I'm always happy for some input, by the way, if you have any interesting cases or I don't know, something. That would be nice. Yeah, Hendrik.
Yeah, all right, in that sense, for once, I'm not sure if you were there, Vanessa, at the colloquium session where Christian Leonard presented his one chapter from his dissertation. Now this is really hush-hush. I'm really unsure about how deep to get into it, but he is really addressing the same the same thematic intersection between civil disobedience and I do seem to remember a radical democratic approach to the question, and it does include critiques of Rawls and Habermas in Berlin that are really close to what you've been saying.
That's interesting.
Yeah, specifically addressing the construction of the subject that gets to, like you said, the actor who gets to, be civilly disobedient or not.
Yeah. Oh, super interesting. What's his name again?
Christian Leonard. I can just text you because I don't think he's quite done yet, but okay. I could possibly ask him for like whether I could give you the text he gave us to review with him.
That would be cool.
Yeah, I think that would be really animating. And you know, for that reason, this was all just I struggled to ask questions because of it, because with your great presentation and his, I'm really well informed now on the topic.
Thank you.
So I don't want to, I don't know, get in front of any other questions, but you put up the question of whether Rawls's theory is contemporary. And I would really like to discuss that, but we don't have to yet if there's other questions. So I don't know.
Yeah. I also put down 2 discussion questions, but I think that's actually a really interesting question. Maybe we could first talk about it if no one else wants to ask something. Okay, then let's do it. So what do you think?
So my hot take is that Rawls's theory would obviously be as contemporary as the thinking that he sparked or maybe embodied as well still is. And I think it's just as contemporary as criticisms or critiques of him are, especially radically democratic. You had the British example from British civil rights struggles, but it's really not that different for contemporary struggles of refugees today. There are many cases of refugees protesting the conditions they are forced to live under, the oppression they are feeling from states and societies in the so-called Western Hemisphere. And they always, have some relation or another to the question of citizenship and in how far they do get to protest or not. One example that comes to mind right now with me is that we had a killing close to Bremen in a city called Delmenhorst in Germany by the police, like a possible murder. I think it would be just as much of a position to take if I would call it just a death. So this possible police murder happened a month and a half, I think, back. And the family of the victim asked the communities that were starting to protest against that to not go overboard with it because they were concerned with their status as people allowed to stay in Germany. So they were really hesitant to even get into that, as the very family who was victimized by this possible police murder. And that's just one example, obviously. But yeah, and so far, I think this question is always very, very contemporary. Yeah, that's just as a start.
That's super interesting, actually, the police killing. Yeah, And it really vividly illustrates the power asymmetries that are between the like police institution and the family. Yeah. Yeah, Vanessa, you're raising.
Yes, I hope I can get all my thoughts into words. I don't know. I feel like it is a very biased view to only talk about violence when it comes to civil disobedience and not when the state executes its authority. Obviously, like why would there be any reason that civilians should be less violently than the state executing its authority? Especially if that is exactly what they protest against, because if they should be non-violent against something that is violently towards them, how can this be justified? And another question I have is regarding, or another thought is regarding the threat of being violent, because I think I'm quoting Judith Butler, that even a threat of something like being deported or being fined if you are not economically safe, that is violence too. That is violence too executed from the state. A threat of violence is violence. And I feel like there's so many dimensions of violence that comes from the state or comes from authorities, from institutions, that could be brought into this perspective and could have been brought into this theory at all. So I know I feel like you can talk so much about violence and state, and yeah, this is such an open discussion.
Yeah, super interesting question that you're raising there. I think that's, of course, because we tend to see somehow violence instrumentalized by the state as more legitimate, which is super weird because, I mean, okay, yes, we voted for a certain political party, but how do we, like, it's assumed that we always give our implicit consent to the certain state authority. And I think, yeah, that's a thought that should be questioned. And I can't. Now I clicked all of you away. Wait. Does anyone want to say something? How can I see you again?
Yes, here.
No.
Yes. To your comment, Vanessa. Obviously, I immediately thought, well, you know, liberal or like state theorists would likely say that the state has a violence monopoly, right? But this again evokes the problematic separation between public and private life, right? And it being in that case, it's sort of the same as the separation between private actions and state actions. Like, was Derek Chauvin, the murderer of George Floyd, was he a private individual when he murdered George Floyd, or was he a state? Was he like an agent of the state when he did that? And in how far is the state then implicit in this? And the fact that the city actually paid George Floyd's family. I think it was I don't know what kind of payment it was exactly. It escapes me right now, but that really suggests that the state is taking on the responsibility here, right? But at the same time, I mean, I don't want to, you know, celebrate the American state here, but they do not really call exactly for the murder of civilians. So where is the line here, or is there even anyone at all? Yeah.
Yeah, and then especially that then the state has to take the burden of these racist actions, and I mean, then again, everyone pays for it through through their taxes, which is quite a weird thought.
Including Floyd's family again.
Yeah. Literally, yeah.
I'm just wondering, like, obviously racism is very institutionalized in the police and in the whole like executive dimension in the US and also in where I live. But I'm wondering, because the killing of people, especially people of color, if not justified by the law, is it still an execution of the state? Is it still a monopoly of the state? Because then it was a policeman, one of very many, that would do it. But he too violated the monopoly of violence of the state, of the law. Not that it is his worst crime, obviously, but I don't know. If the liberal really would say that, I would say, well, that's not really given at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a good point that you're raising. Yeah, it's interesting. I wish we had a convinced liberal to now argue with. That would be great.
Just one small thing, I neglected to actually say the name of the victim in the killing in Delmenhorst. His name was Kosai. Just wanted to add that there, because this tends to be a problem with these kinds of things. And obviously, it's hard for us to all remember all the many victims, but I did want to drop it in here.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, does anyone else want to say something about this issue? Otherwise, we could also maybe talk about your opinion on violence and when it comes to civil disobedience.
Just a small thing, maybe to close this, because we've been really reliant on like the matter of state violence, or maybe sort of state violence, institutionalized racism, and the actors therein. Obviously, it goes beyond that, right? So wherever, I mean, still the discussion of the so-called refugee crisis is, really comes to mind easily. And I think there it was just everywhere, this idea of participation depends on you contributing to a society, and you only contributed to a society once you work in this society, but you can only really work in a society once you're a civilian, but people won't let you be a civilian before you contributed there. And I think all of these discourses, they are at least somewhat in the line with Rawls's thinking. Like, he's not the main culprit here, obviously, but the limitation to the nation state is everywhere in his theory. It's not just on this issue of civil disobedience, it's everywhere. You can't really modulate anything beyond the nation state, and he's really affirming that international system of nation states. So yeah.
Yeah, totally. And then he, as also the critics have explained, he doesn't really account for civil disobedience that would disrupt the order, the current order. I think that's quite interesting, because it goes again. I mean, although Rawls' theory of justice was before the end of history, but in the end of history, he, like Fukuyama, basically writes that liberalism is will kind of solve all the problems, and that it will be the end. And this idea is almost quite present in Rawls' theory, also not explicitly but implicitly, because it assumes that we don't ever need a system change.
Wait, Stefanos.
Yeah. Do you have any opinions about whether we should express civil disobedience violently or non-violently? What's your thought on that?
I think, oh, sorry. Okay, so I think it depends on the cause, right? If your cause is something that can be solved within the system, maybe Rawls is the theory for you. Maybe then you can do the non-violent civil disobedience, because then it works. However, but if your criticism on what is happening goes beyond the system, maybe something that is against capitalism, something that is against institutionalized racism, something like that, that goes beyond the framework that we have in our state, then maybe non-violent civil disobedience is not enough, or cannot be justified, even if something is so violent. Yeah. But I think it really depends.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, Andrew?
Yeah, obviously I'm thinking towards the same direction. I mean, the way, I mean, I'm not sure. I'm not really remembering entirely my reading of Rawls. But the way you put it, there's, you know, like non-violence just means no violence against anything. Like, and like the matter of property is heightened there, is stressed especially. And that kind of suggests an equalizing in how he evaluates violence against people and property, right? And that is problematic in itself. That is deeply affirmative of a capitalist economic order. And just like Vanessa said, that just means that you will never be able to go beyond that economic system, which is not supposed to be, at least, the political system, with his version of civil disobedience.
Yeah, I agree. And even like the question of, well, what is violence? Like, you know, like, I mean, there are, of course, like, you shouldn't murder people who are on the other side of the protest, but that's not the question. Like, I feel like often when it comes to opponents of violence, they kind of think about violence in a quite horrific sense, but we're not talking about a Hobbesian state of nature here. We're talking about still, like, maybe also limited forms of violence. And yeah, of course, that's like, yeah, that's I've always wondered also, like, how Rawls conceptualize violence, and I think it's quite an ambiguous, like, yeah, it's quite ambiguous in his writings. He never really defines clearly what he means by violence, like what constitutes a violent act. Yeah, Jan.
Another point was his reasoning, or like a part of his reasoning for nonviolence was always this: if you don't act nonviolently, you won't have any chance to convince the majority.
Yeah.
And you already addressed, I think, or like the criticisms you accounted already. Talked about the fact. Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. My point was going to be the cause. I mean, it's always hard to address theorists with, have you ever tested this empirically, that you can only convince people non-violently? And I don't really want to do that, but at the same time, I think there's this sort of fallacy, maybe not with Rawls, but with the liberal societies that succeeded him in his theory in a way, where major changes, historic changes in societies are ascribed to nonviolent movements, right? But who's to say that the violent action that often took place at the same times as nonviolent actions also contributed, and maybe nonviolent and violent principles of action can go hand in hand to cause change. But afterwards, you know, history is always written by the victor, and they're going to say it was only the nonviolent protests, the civil disobedience in Rawls's understanding that really led to the change. But that may well be a fallacy.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I'm so sorry. Now I think I actually have to go. And we're in such a nice discussion.
Yeah.
But is it okay for you, because they need to check something at the dishwasher?
No, that's okay.
There the last time.
We're over time anyways. I think we can just, maybe you other guys are still up for to keep discussing, or we could just end it here. right? But you, I'm gonna end the capturing.
Yeah, the screen sharing, yeah.